close your eyes and imagine the desert night in ancient Mesopotamia, 4,000 years before the Common Era. The wind howls across endless dunes, carrying with it the whispers of spirits older than civilization itself. The air is thick with sand and heat, even in darkness. There are no cities here, no temples, no protection. Only the vast emptiness where the wind makes its home. And in that wind, the ancient Sumerians believed there lived demons. They called them the Lilitu, storm spirits, night demons, bringers of death and disease, female entities that rode the desert winds, that entered homes through cracks in walls, that strangled infants in their cradles and drove men to madness with fevered dreams. The Lilitu were not metaphors. They were not symbols. To the people of ancient Sumer and Babylon, they were as real as the sand beneath their feet and infinitely more dangerous. This is where our story truly begins. Not in the Garden of Eden, not with Adam, not with rebellion against God, but here in the howling darkness of the Mesopotamian night, with creatures of wind and shadow that predated the Bible by thousands of years. For Lilith, the figure we know from Jewish mysticism and medieval demonology, did not begin as a woman. She began as a demon, a force of nature, a manifestation of everything the ancient world feared about the darkness beyond the firelight. The earliest written references to the Lilitu appear in Sumerian texts dating to approximately 2000 before the Common Era. These texts describe them as a class of demons, not a single entity. They were wind spirits associated with storms, with the desolate places where no human could survive, with the liminal spaces between civilization and wilderness. The Lilitu were said to haunt ruins, to dwell in deserted buildings, to make their homes in the wasteland where nothing grew. But most terrifyingly, the Lilitu had a particular appetite. They preyed on pregnant women and newborn children in a world without modern medicine, where childbirth was one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face, where infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. The Lilitu provided an explanation for the inexplicable. Why did healthy babies sometimes stop breathing in the night? Why did some women die in childbirth despite the midwife's best efforts? Why did fevers come suddenly, consuming a child within days? The answer to the ancient Mesopotamians was clear. The Lilitu had come in the darkness and stolen the life force away. Ancient Babylonian incantations reveal the depth of this fear. Clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system of ancient Mesopotamia, contain prayers and spells specifically designed to ward off the Lilitu. These texts describe the demons in vivid, terrifying detail. They have long, wild hair that flows like the desert wind. Their hands end in talons capable of tearing flesh. They move with impossible speed, appearing and disappearing like gusts of wind. They enter rooms through the smallest openings, unable to be locked out by any mortal door. One such incantation reads, translated from the ancient Akkadian language: the Lilitu who flies through windows, who enters through doorways, who follows men from the streets and enters their homes. She who causes pregnant women to miscarry, she who steals the breath from infants, she who brings disease and fever. I conjure you by heaven and earth, by the great gods, depart from this house and do not return. Notice the specificity of the threat. The Lilitu does not simply kill. She causes miscarriages. She steals infant breath. These are targeted attacks on the most vulnerable, on new life, on the continuity of the family line. In ancient societies, where a family's survival depended on children to work the land and care for aging parents, where high infant mortality meant that many babies did not survive to adulthood, the Lilitu represented an existential threat. But the Lilitu were not merely child killers. They also preyed on men in a different, equally disturbing way. Ancient texts describe how the Lilitu would come to men in their sleep, appearing as beautiful women, seducing them in dreams, and draining their life force through sexual encounters. Men who suffered from what we would now call nocturnal emissions believed they had been visited by a Lilitu. The demon had taken their seed, their vital essence, and used it for dark purposes. This belief reveals something crucial about how the Lilitu were understood. They were vampiric entities, but they did not drink blood in the way we typically imagine vampires. Instead, they consumed life force itself. From infants, they took breath and vitality, causing sudden death. From men, they took seed and essence, causing weakness and exhaustion. They were parasites that fed on human life energy, leaving their victims drained, diseased, or dead. The Lilitu were also associated with a specific type of madness. Men who became obsessed with a woman who did not exist, who claimed to see a beautiful female figure that no one else could perceive, who wasted away from unrequited love for a phantom. These men were said to be under the spell of a Lilitu. The demon had attached herself to him, appearing in his dreams and visions, consuming his sanity along with his life force. Archaeological evidence supports the pervasiveness of Lilitu beliefs in ancient Mesopotamia. Amulets have been discovered, small clay or metal objects inscribed with protective spells against the Lilitu. These amulets were worn by pregnant women or hung above the beds of newborn infants. They invoked various gods and goddesses, asking for protection against the night demons. The god Pazuzu, himself a demon, but one who protected against other demons, appears frequently on such amulets. His frightening visage meant to scare away the Lilitu. The consistency of these beliefs across millennia and across the various cultures of Mesopotamia, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, is striking. Each successive civilization inherited the fear of the Lilitu from its predecessors and elaborated upon it. The demons became more defined, more detailed, more terrifying with each retelling. In Babylonian mythology, the Lilitu were sometimes described as the handmaidens or servants of the goddess Ishtar, particularly in her aspect as a goddess of war and destruction. Ishtar herself was a complex deity associated with love and beauty, but also with violence and chaos. Her connection to the Lilitu suggests that these demons were not purely evil in the Mesopotamian worldview, but rather represented the destructive aspect of the divine feminine, the dark mirror of Ishtar's creative and nurturing powers. There were different types of Lilitu, each with specific characteristics and dangers. The Ardat Lily was a young female demon, the spirit of a woman who died before marriage and childbirth. Frustrated and angry at being denied her natural role, she would attack pregnant women and brides, seeking to prevent others from achieving what she could not. The Urdu Lily was the male counterpart, the spirit of a man who died before fathering children, who would drain the fertility from living men. But above all these variations, one figure began to emerge as the most powerful, most dangerous of all the Lilitu. In some later Babylonian texts, she is simply called Lilith, the singular, the queen of the night demons. She is described as more beautiful than the other Lilitu, more cunning, more powerful. She does not merely attack randomly, but chooses her victims with terrible purpose. She is the supreme predator of the darkness, the ultimate embodiment of everything the ancients feared about the night. This Babylonian Lilith had wings like an owl, allowing her to fly silently through the darkness. She had the feet of a bird of prey, talons that could grip and tear. In some depictions, she is shown naked, emphasizing her seductive danger, her ability to tempt and destroy through sexuality. She is often portrayed standing on the backs of lions, demonstrating her dominance over even the most fearsome natural predators. She holds the rod and ring, symbols of divine authority in Mesopotamian iconography, suggesting that she possesses power rivaling that of the gods themselves. The most famous artistic representation of this figure comes from what is known as the Burney relief, or the Queen of the Night plaque, a terracotta relief dating to approximately 1800 before the Common Era. It shows a beautiful, naked, winged woman with bird talons for feet, wearing a horned crown that signifies divinity. She stands on two lions with two owls flanking her. For decades, scholars have debated the identity of this figure. Is it Ishtar? Is it Ereshkigal, goddess of the underworld? Or is it Lilith herself, the queen of demons, depicted in her full terrible glory? The association with owls is particularly significant. Owls are nocturnal hunters, silent flyers, birds that see in the darkness that blinds human eyes. In many ancient cultures, owls were considered ominous, associated with death and the supernatural. The connection between Lilith and owls reinforces her nature as a creature of the night, a hunter who strikes from the darkness without warning. But why did the Lilitu, and Lilith in particular, become so focused on attacking women and children? Modern scholars have proposed various theories. Some suggest that these demons represented the very real dangers of childbirth and infant mortality, personified as malevolent entities because humans needed something to blame, something to ward off. When faced with tragedies they could not prevent or understand. Others argue that the Lilitu represented male anxiety about female sexuality and reproduction. Women possessed the mysterious power to create life, a power that men could not fully control or comprehend. The Lilitu, female demons who corrupted that creative power, who turned it toward death instead of life, embodied male fear of the feminine as a force that could be destructive as well as nurturing. Still others interpret the Lilitu as representations of the wilderness itself, of nature's indifference to human life and human needs. The desert that surrounded Mesopotamian cities was hostile to human existence. It offered no water, no food, no shelter. It was a place where humans died quickly if they lost their way. The Lilitu, as spirits of the desolate places, embodied that hostile wilderness, bringing its deadly nature into the heart of civilization. Whatever the psychological or sociological origins of these beliefs, their impact was profound and lasting. For thousands of years, people in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions lived in genuine fear of the Lilitu. They performed rituals to protect their children. They wore amulets to ward off the demons. They whispered prayers and incantations. They made offerings to protective deities. The Lilitu shaped how people understood disease, death, sexuality, and the dangers of the night. And this is crucial to understand, because when we talk about Lilith, as she appears in Jewish mysticism and medieval Christian demonology, we are not talking about a figure invented from whole cloth. We are talking about the evolution of beliefs that were already ancient when the first books of the Bible were written. The Lilith of Jewish tradition did not appear suddenly in medieval texts. She emerged from a continuous tradition of Lilitu beliefs that stretched back millennia into the pre-biblical past. The ancient Hebrews, living in the same region as the Babylonians, speaking related Semitic languages, engaging in trade and cultural exchange, inevitably encountered Lilitu beliefs. They knew the stories. They feared the same demons. And eventually, they would incorporate this ancient night demon into their own religious framework, transforming her from a class of wind spirits into a single, terrifying figure with a role in the creation narrative itself. But that transformation did not happen immediately. It took centuries. First, Lilith had to make the journey from Babylonian demonology into Hebrew scripture. And that journey begins with a single cryptic mention in the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah, one of the major prophetic texts of the Hebrew Bible, contains a passage describing the desolation that will befall Edom, a neighboring kingdom, as divine punishment. The prophet describes how the land will become a wasteland, inhabited only by wild animals and unclean spirits. The passage, in chapter 34, verse 14, lists the creatures that will dwell in this cursed place: jackals and hyenas, ostriches and ravens, and among them, one word that has puzzled translators for centuries. In the original Hebrew, the word is Lilith. In the King James Version of the Bible, it is translated as screech owl. In other translations, it appears as night creature or night monster, or simply Lilith. The context makes clear that whatever Lilith is, she is an unclean thing, a creature of desolation. something that dwells in ruins and abandoned places. This is perfectly consistent with the Babylonian Lilitu traditions. She is a demon of the wasteland, making her home where human civilization has collapsed. This single biblical reference is crucial because it establishes Lilith's presence, however briefly, in canonical Hebrew scripture. She is acknowledged, even if not explained. She exists in the same textual universe as Adam, Eve, Abraham, and Moses. This tiny foothold in scripture would later allow Jewish mystics to expand her role enormously, to weave elaborate narratives about her involvement in creation and the fall. But at this point, in the original text of Isaiah, she is simply one among many terrifying things that inhabit the cursed wilderness. For centuries after Isaiah, Lilith remained a peripheral figure in Jewish thought. She appears occasionally in the Talmud, the vast collection of rabbinic commentary and law compiled between the 3rd and 6th centuries of the Common Era. In these Talmudic passages, she is treated as a demon, dangerous, but not particularly unique. Men are warned not to sleep alone in a house because Lilith might visit them in the night. Amulets and protective prayers are prescribed to keep her away from newborns. One Talmudic passage describes the physical dangers posed by Lilith. It warns that a man who sleeps alone in a house may be seized by Lilith, and that she has long hair, which she uses to trap her victims. Another passage discusses how to protect children from Lilith's attacks, recommending specific amulets inscribed with the names of angels who have power over her. These early Jewish sources treat Lilith exactly as the earlier Mesopotamian sources treated the Lilitu. She is a demon who attacks the vulnerable, who operates in the night, who must be warded off through ritual and protective magic. There is no mention yet of her being Adam's first wife, no elaborate backstory, no rebellion narrative. She is simply a dangerous supernatural entity that the faithful must guard against. But myths evolve, stories grow, and as Jewish communities spread throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean world, encountering different cultures and different mythological traditions, the figure of Lilith would absorb new elements, new stories, new meanings. The transformation from demon to first woman was approaching, though it would take nearly 1,000 more years to fully manifest. The world that created the Lilitu was harsh, unforgiving, and filled with dangers, both natural and supernatural. In that world, demons like Lilith were explanations for the unexplainable, scapegoats for unavoidable tragedies, and embodiments of primal fears. The desert wind still howls across Mesopotamia. The ruins of ancient cities still stand in desolation, and in the dark corners of human consciousness, in the fears we carry about the night and what it might bring, Lilith still waits, as she has waited for 4,000 years, patient and predatory and eternal. This is her origin. This is where she came from, not from the Garden of Eden, but from the wasteland that existed long before any garden, from the chaos that preceded creation, from the darkness that was there at the beginning and will be there at the end. She is primordial. She is ancient. And everything that comes after, all the stories of Adam and rebellion and the birth of demons, all of it builds on this foundation. Lilith was a demon before she was a woman. And perhaps, in the deepest understanding of her myth, she remains a demon still, wearing the face of humanity, but never losing the talons, the wings, the hunger for life that defines the Lilitu of the ancient world. Now we must leave the desert winds of Mesopotamia and enter a garden. But this is not the Garden of Eden you know from Sunday school or from classical paintings. This is a different creation story, one that exists in the shadows of the canonical text, whispered in Jewish mystical traditions, elaborated in medieval commentaries, and finally written down in texts that the mainstream religious authorities tried desperately to suppress. This is the story of what happened before Eve. This is the story of Adam's first wife. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We know this story. The 6 days of creation, light and darkness, sky and sea, plants and animals, and on the 6th day, humanity. But here is where the story splits, where 2 different accounts in the book of Genesis tell what appear to be 2 different versions of human creation. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27 states, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." Notice the phrasing. Male and female created simultaneously, both in God's image, with no indication that one came before the other, or that one was derived from the other. But then, in Genesis chapter 2, we get a different account. God forms Adam from the dust of the earth, breathes life into him, places him in the Garden of Eden, and only later, after observing that it is not good for man to be alone, creates Eve from Adam's rib while Adam sleeps. These are 2 distinct creation narratives, and biblical scholars have long recognized them as such. They likely come from different source traditions that were later woven together by the editors who compiled Genesis. But to ancient and medieval rabbis studying these texts, the contradiction demanded an explanation. If Genesis 1 says male and female were created together, but Genesis 2 says Eve was created from Adam's rib, then who was the woman created alongside Adam in the first account? The answer, according to an interpretive tradition that developed over centuries, was Lilith. The logic was compelling. God created Adam and Lilith simultaneously, both from the dust of the earth, both equal in their origin. This was the creation described in Genesis 1, but something went wrong. Lilith left, or was expelled or rebelled. The details vary, and so God tried again. This time, he created Eve from Adam's rib, while Adam slept, perhaps learning from the failure of the first creation. Eve, being made from Adam rather than independently, would not have the same claim to equality that Lilith had possessed. She would be, in some fundamental sense, derivative of Adam rather than his peer. This interpretation solved a textual problem, but it created a profound theological and narrative challenge. What happened to Lilith? Why did the first creation fail? What was her fate after leaving the garden? And most importantly, what was her role in the cosmic drama of creation, fall, and redemption that defines the biblical narrative? The answers to these questions would be elaborated in a variety of Jewish mystical texts, particularly in the Kabbalistic tradition that flourished in medieval Spain and the Middle East. But the fullest and most influential account appears in a text called the Alphabet of Ben-Sira, written sometime around the 10th century of the Common Era. We will examine that text in detail later. For now, let us simply tell the story as it came to be known, the dark history of the first woman. God created Adam from the dust of the earth, the Adamah, the red clay from which his name derives. Adam was alone in the Garden of Eden, tending it and naming the animals as God brought them before him. But as Adam named the animals, he observed that each creature had a mate. The lions had lionesses. The birds had their pairs. Every living thing had a companion, except for Adam. And God, seeing this, said, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." So God took the same dust of the earth from which he had formed Adam, and he shaped another human being. Not derivative, not secondary, not taken from Adam's body, but created independently, formed from the same material, animated by the same divine breath. Her name was Lilith. Lilith was Adam's equal in every way. She was as intelligent, as articulate, as physically capable. She had the same dominion over the garden, the same relationship with God, the same essential nature. And at first, there was harmony. Adam and Lilith walked together in the garden. They explored its wonders. They spoke with God in the cool of the day. They were the first humans, the progenitors of all humanity, together in paradise. But then came the conflict. The traditional accounts are quite specific about the nature of this conflict, almost uncomfortably so. Adam desired to lay with Lilith, to engage in the act through which humanity would be propagated. But he insisted that Lilith must lie beneath him, that he must be on top, that this was the proper order of things. After all, was he not the first created? Did not his name, Adam, mean earth or humanity in the broadest sense? Was he not the one to whom God had given the task of naming all living things? Lilith refused. "Why should I lie beneath you?" she demanded. "I am your equal. We were both created from the same earth. We are both made in God's image. There is no reason for you to be above and me below. We are the same." This was not merely a disagreement about sexual position. It was a fundamental challenge to hierarchy, to the assumption of male dominance, to the order that Adam believed was natural and divinely ordained. If Lilith would not submit in this most intimate act, if she claimed equality even here, then she was rejecting the entire framework of gender relations that Adam expected. Adam insisted. Lilith continued to refuse. The argument escalated. And finally, in a moment of rage and power, Lilith did something that should have been impossible. She spoke the ineffable name of God. This requires explanation. In Jewish tradition, God's true name, represented by the 4 Hebrew letters Yod, He, Vav, He, and often vocalized as Yahweh or Jehovah, was considered too sacred to speak aloud. It was the name of power, the name through which God had created the universe, the name that contained within it the essence of divine authority. To speak this name was to invoke creative and destructive power beyond human comprehension. Only the high priest was permitted to speak the name, and only once per year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, in the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber of the temple in Jerusalem. For anyone else to speak, it was blasphemy of the highest order, a usurpation of divine prerogative. Yet Lilith spoke it. How did she know it? Some sources suggest that she learned it from God himself during conversations in the garden. Others imply that as a being created directly by God, formed from the same earth as Adam, and animated by the same divine breath, she possessed innate knowledge of the name. Regardless, she spoke it, and in speaking it, she accessed power that transformed her. Wings sprouted from her shoulders, not the feathered wings of birds, but the leathery wings of bats or demons, dark and membranous and powerful. She rose into the air, looking down at Adam with contempt and fury. And then she flew. She flew out of the Garden of Eden, over the walls of paradise, leaving behind the first man and the harmony that might have been. She flew to the wilderness. She flew to the desert. She flew to the shores of the Red Sea, to a desolate place where no human dwelt, where the rocks were sharp and the sand was burning and nothing grew. This was a place of demons, of spirits, of the Lilitu who had existed long before the garden. And Lilith, once the first woman, made it her home. Adam was alone again. He went to God and complained, "The woman you gave me has abandoned me. She has fled the garden. I am alone." Some versions of the story suggest that Adam was not merely lonely, but humiliated. Lilith had rejected him, challenged his authority, and then left. He demanded that God bring her back, force her to return, compel her submission. God listened to Adam's complaint. And then, in an act that reveals much about the nature of divine authority and the limits of even God's power over free will, God sent 3 angels to retrieve Lilith and bring her back to the garden. Their names were Sen, Sansonoi, and Semengaloth. These 3 angels had specific dominion over demons and evil spirits. They were warriors of the heavenly host, powerful and terrible, sent on a divine mission to return the wayward first woman to her rightful place beside Adam. They found Lilith at the Red Sea, in the midst of the demonic wilderness. And when they saw her, they saw that she had already changed. She was no longer simply a woman. She had consorted with demons. She had become something other, something between human and spirit, a hybrid creature of tremendous and terrifying power. The angels delivered God's command. Return to the garden. Return to Adam. Resume your place as his wife. This is God's will. Lilith refused. I will not return, she declared. I will not submit to Adam. I was created as his equal, and I will not be subjugated. I will not lie beneath him. I will not be his subordinate. I would rather dwell here, in the wilderness among demons, than return to the garden as something less than I was created to be. The angels were shocked. No one refused a direct command from God, delivered by angelic messengers. This was rebellion beyond measure, defiance that warranted the most severe punishment. They threatened Lilith with death. They promised to kill her where she stood if she did not obey. But Lilith, who now possessed knowledge and power she had not had in the garden, made a counteroffer. A terrible, tragic counteroffer that would define her existence for all eternity. I cannot return to Adam, she said, but I acknowledge that there must be consequences for my refusal. Therefore, I accept this punishment. I will give birth to many children, demon children, spirits born of my union with the forces of this wilderness. And every day, 100 of my children will die. 100 every single day for all eternity. This is the price I will pay for my freedom. I accept it. The angels were horrified by this proposition. 100 demon children dying every day. An eternity of loss and grief. What mother would accept such terms? But Lilith's resolve was absolute. She would rather endure endless, repeated loss than surrender her autonomy and return to subordination. The angels conferred. They returned to heaven and presented Lilith's offer to God. And God, in his inscrutable wisdom, accepted it. Perhaps he recognized that Lilith's will could not be broken without destroying her entirely. Perhaps he saw that her punishment would serve a larger purpose in the cosmic order. Or perhaps, as some mystical texts suggest, God had always known that the first creation would fail, that Lilith was a necessary part of the plan, a representation of what humanity would become when it chose knowledge and autonomy over obedience and innocence. But the agreement included one additional clause, negotiated between Lilith and the 3 angels. Lilith would indeed become a demon, a predator of humanity, particularly of newborns and pregnant women. She would haunt the night, seeking to harm the children of Eve, the second wife who had replaced her. But if a child wore an amulet inscribed with the names of the 3 angels, Sen, Sansonoi, and Semengaloth, Lilith would have no power over that child. The names of the angels who had confronted her would serve as protection against her attacks. This is why, for centuries, Jewish families hung amulets above the beds of newborn infants, inscribed with the names of these 3 angels. This is why protective prayers invoked their authority. They were guardians specifically empowered to protect against Lilith, and their names formed a barrier she could not cross. With the agreement made, Lilith remained in the wilderness. The angels returned to heaven, and Adam, still alone in the garden, awaited the creation of Eve, the second woman, the one who would be made from his rib, and who would, at least initially, accept the subordinate role that Lilith had rejected. But Lilith was not finished with humanity. Her story was only beginning. For even as Eve lived in the garden beside Adam, even as she was tempted by the serpent and ate the fruit, and was expelled from paradise along with her husband, Lilith watched from the wilderness. She had left the garden first. She had rebelled first. She had chosen knowledge and autonomy and freedom over the safety of Eden. And now, transformed into a demon, empowered by her union with the dark forces of the wilderness, Lilith would haunt humanity forever. She would be the night visitor, the child stealer, the corrupter of men, the first rebel, the woman who said no to God himself and paid the ultimate price for her defiance. This is how a protective mother goddess from Mesopotamia became the first feminist, the original rebel against patriarchy, the woman who refused to submit even when faced with divine punishment. This is how an ancient demon was given a human face, a human story, a human choice that resonates across millennia. But the story is not over. We have seen Lilith in the garden. We have witnessed her rebellion and flight. Now, we must follow her into the wilderness and see what she became in the ages after Eden, in the long, dark centuries when she made her home among demons and became the mother of monsters. The Red Sea stretched before Lilith like a boundary between worlds. To the west lay Egypt and Africa, lands that would birth great civilizations. To the east lay Arabia, endless desert, the empty quarter, where only the hardiest Bedouin tribes dared venture. And here, on these desolate shores, where salt and sand mixed under a merciless sun, Lilith made her new home. This was not an arbitrary choice. The Red Sea held significance in ancient Near Eastern cosmology. It was a place of transition, of crossing over, of movement between states of being. Later, the Israelites would cross the Red Sea in their exodus from Egypt, passing through walls of water in a miraculous transformation from slavery to freedom. But long before that deliverance, Lilith crossed her own metaphorical sea, leaving behind her humanity and embracing her demonic nature. The shores of the Red Sea were inhabited, if that is the right word, by spirits and demons that predated human creation. These were the entities the Mesopotamians had called the Lilitu, the storm demons and night spirits we discussed in the first part of our journey. Lilith, fleeing from the garden, flying on her newly manifested wings, came to the place where her spiritual ancestors dwelt. She came home to her kind, and there, in that desolate wilderness, she underwent a transformation that would define her existence for all eternity. The texts are unclear about exactly what happened during Lilith's time at the Red Sea before the angels arrived. Some sources suggest that she immediately began consorting with demons, engaging in sexual unions that would produce her demon children, the Lilin. Others propose that she spent time in meditation or rage, processing her exile and rejection before turning to the demonic forces around her. What is clear is that by the time the three angels, Sen, Sansonoi, and Semengoloth found her, Lilith had already changed fundamentally. The woman who had walked in the Garden of Eden no longer existed in any meaningful sense. In her place stood something new, a hybrid being, part human, part demon, belonging fully to neither category, but drawing power from both. Imagine the confrontation. 3 radiant angels, beings of pure light and divine authority, descending upon the barren shores of the Red Sea. They blazed with holy fire. Their voices carried the weight of heaven's command. They were terrifying in their beauty, awesome in their power. They had been sent by God Himself to retrieve a wayward creature and return her to her proper place in the order of creation. And standing before them, knee-deep in the bitter waters of the Red Sea, was Lilith. Her dark hair whipped around her in the desert wind. Her wings, bat-like and membranous, spread wide in defiance. Her eyes, which had once looked upon God with love and wonder in the garden, now burned with rage and determination. She was naked, unashamed, powerful in her refusal to submit to any authority. Lilith, the angels proclaimed, "You are commanded by the Lord God, creator of heaven and earth, to return to the Garden of Eden. You are to resume your place as wife to Adam. You are to submit to your role in the divine plan. This is not a request. This is a command." The angels expected obedience. Every created being obeyed God's commands. Angels obeyed. Animals obeyed according to their nature. Even the sun and moon obeyed the ordinances God had set for them. The idea that Lilith, a created being, a creature formed from earth and animated by divine breath, would refuse a direct command delivered by angelic messengers was almost incomprehensible. But Lilith did refuse. "I will not return," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I was created equal to Adam. I will not be his subordinate. I will not lie beneath him. I will not pretend that my creation from the same earth as his creation makes me less than him. I reject the role you have assigned to me." The angels were shocked into momentary silence. Then Sen, the first of the 3, spoke with the full authority of heaven behind his words. "If you do not return, you will die. God will strike you down where you stand. Your existence will end. You will be unmade. Death, annihilation. A return to the nothingness that preceded creation. For any being, this should have been the ultimate threat. But Lilith, who had already lost everything by leaving the garden, who had already sacrificed paradise for autonomy, did not flinch. "Then let me die," she said. "I would rather cease to exist than exist as something less than I was created to be." This response threw the angels into confusion. They had the power to destroy her. God had granted them that authority, but to destroy her seemed wasteful, a admission of failure. Surely there was another way, a punishment that would serve justice without requiring annihilation. Sansonoi, the second angel, proposed an alternative. What if there were consequences for your refusal that did not require your destruction? What if you were to live, but to suffer continuously for your rebellion? Would you accept such a punishment? And here, Lilith made the terrible bargain that has defined her myth for 1,000 years. I will accept this, she said. I will remain here in the wilderness. I will consort with the demons of this place. I will bear children, many children, demon children born of my union with the spirits of the desolate lands. And every day, every single day for all eternity, 100 of my children will die. I will suffer the loss of 100 children per day. This is the price I will pay for my freedom. I accept it willingly. Think about what this means. Lilith was agreeing to become a mother who would watch 100 of her children die every day, forever. 3,650,000 children per decade. 3,650,000 per century. Across millennia, billions upon billions of deaths, each one a piece of her heart torn away. Each loss, a new grief added to an accumulating weight of sorrow that would eventually exceed any mortal's capacity to bear. Why would anyone accept such terms? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of freedom and the price some are willing to pay for it. Lilith valued her autonomy more than she valued happiness, more than she valued comfort, even more than she valued her own children. The principle of equality, of self-determination, of refusing to submit to unjust authority. These were worth any cost, even infinite cost, even eternal suffering. The third angel, Samael, considered Lilith's offer. The angels consulted among themselves. And finally, they agreed, but with an addition. Yes, Lilith would suffer the daily loss of 100 demon children. But in exchange for this punishment, Lilith would be granted power over human children, the children of Eve, the woman who had replaced her. She would be able to attack newborns, to steal their breath in the night, to bring disease and death to the children of the woman who had accepted the subordinate role. Lilith refused. However, and this was crucial, Lilith's power would not be absolute. If a child were protected by an amulet bearing the names of the three angels, Sen, Sansonoi, and Samael, Lilith would be powerless against that child. The very angels who had confronted her, whose names represented divine authority and judgment, would serve as a protective barrier that Lilith could not cross. Lilith accepted these terms. The agreement was sealed. The angels returned to heaven to report to God. And Lilith remained at the Red Sea, beginning her new existence as a demon, as a mother of monsters, as a predator of humanity. But this raises a troubling theological question. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, why did he allow this? Why negotiate with a rebel? Why grant Lilith power to harm innocent children? Why not simply destroy her, or strip her of power, or force her to return to the garden? The mystical tradition offers several answers. Some texts suggest that God allowed Lilith's rebellion because free will requires the genuine possibility of refusal. If Lilith had no choice but to obey, then her obedience would be meaningless. The existence of beings who can and do refuse God's commands is necessary for free will to be real. Lilith, in this interpretation, serves as proof that choice exists, even for created beings. Other sources propose that Lilith's role is pedagogical. She exists to teach humanity about the consequences of rebellion, about the price of choosing autonomy over obedience. She is a living warning, a demonstration of what happens when pride and self-determination lead one away from God's plan. Still, other texts, particularly in the more dualistic strands of Jewish mysticism, suggest that Lilith serves a necessary function in the cosmic order. She represents the left side of creation, the forces of judgment and severity that balance the right side of mercy and kindness. God created both sides, both forces, because a universe of only mercy would lack justice, and a universe of only kindness would lack the capacity for meaningful choice and consequence. Regardless of the theological explanation, the result was the same. Lilith became a demon, but not just any demon. She became the queen of demons, the most powerful of all the dark spirits that haunt humanity. Her origins as a human, created directly by God, gave her knowledge and capabilities that purely spiritual demons lacked. She understood humanity from the inside. She knew human weaknesses, human desires, human vulnerabilities, and she used that knowledge with terrible effectiveness. The first thing Lilith did, according to the texts, was to begin producing her demon children, the Lilin. The accounts of how she accomplished this vary. Some sources say she mated with the demon Samael, also known as the angel of death or the adversary. Samael was himself a fallen angel or a demon of tremendous power, second only to Satan himself in some hierarchies of hell. The union between Lilith and Samael produced countless demon offspring, each inheriting aspects of both parents' natures. Other texts describe Lilith mating with Asmodeus, the demon king associated with lust and carnal desires. Asmodeus appears in the Book of Tobit, one of the deuterocanonical books accepted by Catholic and Orthodox Christians, but not by Protestant or Jewish traditions. In that story, Asmodeus kills 7 husbands of a woman named Sarah on their wedding nights before they can consummate the marriage. His association with Lilith links 2 demonic figures concerned with corrupting human sexuality and reproduction. Still, other sources suggest that Lilith did not need a demonic partner to produce offspring. As a being who had spoken the ineffable name of God, who had accessed creative power reserved for the divine, she could generate demon children through her will alone, birthing spirits and monsters without the need for any father. Regardless of how they were conceived and born, the Lilin inherited their mother's nature. They were predators of humanity, particularly of children and pregnant women. They haunted the night, appearing in dreams and shadows. They fed on fear and grief. They embodied every anxiety a parent might have about losing a child, every nightmare about waking to find the cradle empty and cold. But remember Lilith's bargain. Every day, 100 of these demon children died. How they died, the texts do not explain clearly. Perhaps the 3 angels actively hunted and destroyed them. Perhaps the act of harming a protected child resulted in the death of one of the Lilin as a form of cosmic balance. Perhaps God himself struck them down as a daily reminder of the cost of Lilith's rebellion. Whatever the mechanism, the result was constant, grinding loss. Lilith brought demon children into existence, loved them in whatever way a demon can love, and then watched them die over and over and over, 100 times a day, every day, forever. This was not merely punishment. It was torture, psychological and emotional torture of a kind no mortal could endure. Yet Lilith endured it. More than that, she embraced it. She chose this fate rather than submit to Adam's authority. And in some twisted way, her daily grief became a source of her power. She knew loss intimately. She knew pain. She knew what it meant to have one's children torn away. And so when she attacked human mothers, when she stole human infants, when she brought death to nurseries and tears to parents, she was, in a sense, sharing her own experience. She was making humanity feel what she felt, creating a symmetry of suffering between herself and the children of Eve. This vampiric quality became central to Lilith's nature. She did not simply kill. She fed. She consumed life force, breath, vitality, essence. From newborns, she took the breath that animated them, leaving behind only cold, still bodies for parents to discover in the morning. From pregnant women, she took the life force of the unborn, causing miscarriages and stillbirths. From men, as we will discuss more in the next part, she took seed and vitality, draining them through nocturnal visitations. Lilith was not merely destructive. She was parasitic. She needed to consume life because she herself was caught between life and death. No longer fully alive as she had been in the garden, not completely dead as a destroyed creature would be, existing instead in a liminal state that required constant infusions of stolen vitality to sustain. The protective amulets used against Lilith became increasingly sophisticated over time. The simplest bore only the names of the 3 angels. More elaborate versions included images, prayers, and protective verses from Scripture. Some showed Lilith herself, bound in chains, rendered powerless through magical representation. Others depicted the 3 angels with swords, ready to defend the child from demonic attack. These amulets were not merely superstitious objects. They represented a fundamental belief that Lilith's power, while terrible, was not unlimited. She could be resisted. She could be driven away. The very fact of the amulet's existence testified to the belief that humans were not helpless before demonic predation, that divine protection was available to those who sought it through proper ritual and faith. The practice of using these amulets spread throughout Jewish communities wherever they existed. From Babylonia to Egypt, from Spain to Poland, from Morocco to Yemen, Jewish mothers hung protective charms above their newborns' beds. They whispered prayers invoking the 3 angels. They performed rituals during pregnancy to ward off Lilith's attention. They sat with laboring women to ensure that Lilith could not attack during the vulnerable moments of childbirth. These practices persisted for centuries, even into the modern era. As recently as the early 20th century, Jewish communities in Eastern Europe and the Middle East continued to use anti-Lilith amulets. The belief in her threat remained real, immediate, and terrifying. Even as the modern world began to explain infant mortality through medicine and science rather than through demonology. But Lilith's story does not end at the Red Sea. Her transformation from woman to demon was complete, but her role in cosmic history was only beginning. She would return to haunt humanity in ways both physical and spiritual. She would become a succubus, a night visitor, a corrupter of male sexuality. She would be implicated in the fall of humanity, some sources claiming she was the serpent in the garden or the force behind the serpent's temptation of Eve. She would become the consort of Satan himself in some traditions, the Dark Queen who ruled alongside the Prince of Darkness. And through it all, she would remain the first woman, the one who was created equal and who refused to become subordinate, the rebel whose defiance cost her everything, but who never regretted her choice, who paid the price every single day and still considered it worthwhile. This is the nature of Lilith's fall. It was not a fall in the sense of a descent into sin or evil. It was a fall in the sense of a choosing of one path over another, knowing full well the costs involved. She fell from grace, yes, but she rose into autonomy. She lost paradise, but she gained self-determination. She was punished, but she was never conquered. The angels returned to heaven. Lilith remained at the Red Sea, and from that desolate place, she would launch a campaign against humanity that continues, according to believers, even now. The war between Lilith and the children of Eve had begun, a war that would make her the most feared female demon in Jewish and Christian demonology, a war that would transform her from a footnote in creation into a central figure of dark mythology. Night falls across the ancient world. In a small house in a Jewish village, a family prepares for sleep. The father has barred the door. The mother has banked the fire. Their newborn son, barely a week old, lies in his cradle near the bed. Above the cradle hangs an amulet, a small piece of parchment inscribed with Hebrew letters spelling out the names Sen, Sansonoi, and Semengaloth. The family believes this amulet will protect their child through the night. They pray it will be enough, because they know that Lilith is hunting. She comes in the darkness, sometime between midnight and dawn, during the hours when the boundary between the living world and the spirit realm grows thin. She has many forms. Sometimes she appears as a beautiful woman with long dark hair and burning eyes. Sometimes she manifests as an owl, silent wings carrying her through the night. Sometimes she is simply a presence, a cold wind, a sudden sense of dread, an unexplained chill in a warm room. She enters through cracks in the walls, through gaps in the shutters, through any opening large enough for air to pass. She cannot be locked out because she is not entirely physical. She exists partially in the spirit realm, able to pass through barriers that would stop a mortal intruder. She approaches the cradle. She looks down at the sleeping infant. The child is perfect, innocent, full of life and potential. And Lilith, who has lost 100 of her own children already today, and will lose 100 more tomorrow, and 100 the day after that for all eternity, reaches down to steal this life, to consume this breath, to add this mother's grief to the cosmic balance of suffering. But then she sees the amulet. The names of the 3 angels blaze in her vision like brands of fire. The covenant she made at the Red Sea binds her. She cannot harm this child. With a shriek of frustration that only the spiritual realm can hear, she departs, moving on to search for an unprotected target, for a mother who did not know to use the amulet, for a family whose faith or knowledge was insufficient to ward her off. This was how Lilith operated, according to the beliefs of ancient and medieval Jewish communities. She was a constant threat, a predator who hunted every night, who could only be stopped by proper ritual protection. And even then, only through the specific power of the 3 angels who had confronted her at the Red Sea. But infant death was only one aspect of Lilith's predation. Her campaign against humanity took many forms, and one of the most disturbing was her role as a succubus, a female demon who sexually assaulted men in their sleep. The concept of the succubus is ancient and widespread, appearing in many cultures under different names. In medieval Christian demonology, succubi were demons who took female form to seduce men, often appearing in dreams as the object of the man's desire, engaging in sexual activity, and stealing the man's seed for demonic purposes. The male equivalent, the incubus, performed a similar function with women. In Jewish tradition, Lilith was identified as the original and most powerful succubus, the template from which all other seductive night demons derived. Her attacks on men had multiple purposes and multiple effects. First, she sought male seed to create more demon children. Remember that Lilith was producing demon offspring continuously, and while some sources describe her as mating with archdemons like Samael or Asmodeus, other texts suggest that she collected human seed from sleeping men and used it to generate hybrid demon-human creatures. These Lilin, born of human fathers and a demonic mother, were particularly dangerous because they inherited both human cunning and demonic power. The mechanism of this seed collection was nocturnal emission. Men who experienced wet dreams, who woke to find evidence of sexual activity during sleep, were taught that they had been visited by Lilith or one of her demon daughters. The pleasure of the dream masked the demonic attack. The man might dream of his wife, or of a beautiful stranger, or of any object of desire, but the dream was a deception created by Lilith to facilitate the theft of his seed. This belief served multiple social and religious purposes. It explained a natural physiological phenomenon in supernatural terms. It provided a mechanism of control over male sexuality, creating guilt and fear around sexual thoughts and nocturnal emissions. It reinforced the idea that sexuality outside of procreative marriage was demonic, literally involving demons, and it positioned Lilith as a direct threat to every man, making her relevant not just to mothers of infants, but to the entire community. Second, Lilith's attacks drained men's vitality. The texts describe men who were repeatedly visited by Lilith becoming weak, pale, exhausted, unable to fulfill their duties as husbands and fathers. They wasted away, consumed by a parasitic relationship with a demon they could not see and often could not consciously remember encountering. The dream encounters left them drained, their life force siphoned away to fuel Lilith's existence and power. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, Lilith could cause obsession. A man who dreamed repeatedly of Lilith might become fixated on the vision, unable to feel desire for his actual wife, consumed by longing for the demon woman who visited him in dreams. This obsession could destroy marriages, ruin lives, and drag the afflicted man deeper into demonic influence. The texts recommend various protections against Lilith's nocturnal predation. Prayers before sleep, amulets worn on the body, specific verses from scripture recited or written on parchment and placed under the pillow, the avoidance of sleeping alone, as Lilith preferentially attacked solitary men, sexual relations with one's wife, as proper channeling of sexual energy was believed to reduce vulnerability to demonic sexual assault. But even with these protections, the threat remained. Lilith was persistent, patient, and powerful. She had eternity to hunt, and humans were vulnerable every time they closed their eyes and surrendered to sleep. The parallels to sleep paralysis are striking. Sleep paralysis is a phenomenon where a person, usually while falling asleep or waking up, becomes temporarily unable to move or speak while remaining consciously aware. It is often accompanied by hallucinations, particularly the sense of a threatening presence in the room, pressure on the chest making breathing difficult, and sometimes visual or auditory hallucinations of an intruder. Modern science explains sleep paralysis through neurology as a temporary disruption in the transition between sleep stages. But for thousands of years, before this scientific understanding existed, people experiencing sleep paralysis interpreted it through their cultural frameworks. And in Jewish and Christian cultures influenced by Lilith mythology, sleep paralysis was often interpreted as a demonic attack, specifically an attack by Lilith or one of her demon daughters. The crushing sensation on the chest, that was Lilith sitting on the paralyzed victim. The inability to move or call for help, that was her power binding the victim's body. The sense of a malevolent presence, that was accurate perception of the demon's true nature. The sexual elements, sometimes associated with sleep paralysis hallucinations, that confirmed the succubus nature of the attack. From a modern perspective, we can see how a natural neurological phenomenon was interpreted through a mythological framework. But we should not dismiss the reality of the terror experienced by those who suffered such episodes. Whether the cause was a demon or a disrupted sleep cycle, the experience was genuinely frightening, and the cultural explanations provided a framework for understanding and potentially defending against what was happening. Lilith's role as succubus also connects her to another ancient tradition, the belief in the nightmare. The word nightmare originally referred not to bad dream, but to a specific entity, a female spirit or demon that sat on the chests of sleeping people, causing them to experience terrifying visions and the sensation of being unable to breathe. The Old English mare meant an evil female spirit, and the nightmare was literally the nocturnal visit of this creature. Across Europe, similar beings appear in folklore under different names. The Germanic Mara, the Slavic Mora, the Greek Ephialtes, the Romanian Mori, all describe nocturnal oppressive spirits that attack sleepers. While not always explicitly connected to Lilith in local traditions, they represent the same archetypal fear, the dread of being vulnerable while asleep, of being attacked in a state of unconsciousness when defense is impossible. Lilith, as the most fully developed and theologically elaborate version of this archetype in Western tradition, became the template through which these various nightmare demons were understood and combated. But Lilith's predation extended beyond individual attacks on children and men. She was also implicated in a broader corruption of human sexuality and reproduction. Some medieval texts describe Lilith as the force behind miscarriages, stillbirths, birth defects, maternal mortality, and infant death beyond just sudden unexplained deaths. She was, in effect, the demon explanation for every reproductive tragedy, every failure of the process by which life continues. This made her terrifying in a society where reproductive success was essential for survival. Without modern medicine, infant and maternal mortality rates were appallingly high. Many women died in childbirth. Many infants did not survive their first year. Families needed many children because they could not expect all of them to reach adulthood. In this context, Lilith represented an existential threat to the continuation of the family line, to the future of the community, to life itself. Interestingly, Lilith's attacks were not always portrayed as random or indiscriminate. Some texts suggest that she preferentially targeted the children of Eve's lineage, seeking revenge against the woman who had replaced her. Others propose that she attacked children conceived in ways she considered improper, perhaps as punishment for sexual transgressions by the parents. Still others suggest that she was simply fulfilling her role in the cosmic order, culling the weak, testing the faithful, serving as a dark counterbalance to the forces of life and creation. The connection to the Greek myth of Lamia is worth exploring here, as it demonstrates how different cultures developed remarkably similar mythological figures to explain similar fears. Lamia in Greek mythology was a beautiful queen loved by Zeus. When Zeus's wife, Hera, discovered the affair, she killed all of Lamia's children in revenge. Driven mad by grief, Lamia transformed into a monster who hunted and devoured the children of other mothers, unable to bear that others still had what she had lost. She became known as a child-eating demon, particularly dangerous to infants and young children. The parallels to Lilith are obvious. Both were once beautiful women. Both lost their children through supernatural intervention. Both transformed into child-hunting demons driven by grief and rage. Both represented the fear of maternal loss turned predatory and monstrous. This suggests that the Lilith myth taps into something universal in human psychology. A deep fear of child loss combined with an attempt to understand and control that fear through mythological narratives. Cultures separated by geography and time developed similar stories because they faced similar tragedies and needed similar explanatory frameworks. But Lilith's story goes beyond simple child stealing. Her relationship with Samael, the demon also identified with Satan, or as a fallen angel second only to Satan, elevates her to cosmic significance. In Kabbalistic tradition, Samael and Lilith are sometimes described as the demonic counterparts to Adam and Eve, or to God and the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of the divine. They represent the left side of creation, the forces of severity, judgment, and the necessary evil that exists in a universe where free will requires the possibility of choosing wrongly. In this framework, Lilith is not simply a rogue demon, but a necessary part of the cosmic structure. She rules over the demonic realm just as God rules over the divine. Her power is real and must be acknowledged, even as it must also be resisted and combated. To deny Lilith's existence or power would be to deny the reality of evil, of suffering, of the darkness that exists in creation alongside the light. This theological elevation of Lilith makes her more than a folk demon to be warded off with amulets. She becomes a player in cosmic drama, an active force in the ongoing spiritual war between good and evil, between obedience and rebellion, between submission to divine order and assertion of individual will. And yet, for all her power, Lilith remains bound by the covenant she made with the three angels. She can be resisted. Her power has limits. The very fact that an amulet with 3 names can stop her demonstrates that she is not omnipotent, that divine authority still supersedes demonic power, that protection is available to those who seek it. This is crucial because it means the Lilith myth is not simply a terror story designed to frighten people. It is also an empowerment story, teaching that even the most powerful demons can be resisted, that vulnerability is not the same as helplessness, that knowledge of the proper protections can save lives. Mothers who hung the amulets were not being foolish or superstitious in any simple sense. They were engaging in the best protective practices their culture offered them, using the spiritual technology available to them to defend their children against perceived threats. That the threats were understood demonologically rather than medically does not diminish the genuine love and care motivating the protective actions. Lilith, the mother of demons, the queen of Succubi, the stealer of children and corrupter of men, thus occupies a complex position in the mythology. She is terrifying, yes, but her terror serves a purpose. She explains tragedy. She provides a framework for protection. She embodies fears that would otherwise be unbearable in their randomness and meaninglessness. And she stands as the ultimate warning of what happens when rebellion against divine order is taken to its extreme conclusion. She lost everything. She gained power. She suffers eternally. She endures. And in her suffering and endurance, she becomes perhaps the most psychologically complex figure in all of demonology, a being whose monstrosity is inseparable from her grief, whose predation is inseparable from her own perpetual loss, whose evil is inseparable from the injustice she believes was done to her in the garden. This is Lilith the succubus, the night demon, the mother of monsters. But her story is not yet complete. We must now examine the texts that solidified her mythology, particularly the medieval work that gave us the fullest account of her creation and rebellion. And we must explore how the Christian Church used her image to demonize female sexuality and independence during the darkest periods of European history. The year is approximately 900 of the Common Era. The exact date is uncertain, as is the exact location, though most scholars place its composition somewhere in the Islamic Middle East, or possibly in Jewish communities of the Mediterranean. A text is being written that will profoundly shape how Lilith is understood for the next 1,000 years and beyond. The text is called the Alphabet of Ben-Sira, and it is, to put it mildly, unusual. Ben-Sira, also known as Suraj or Ecclesiasticus, was the author of a respected wisdom text that is part of the biblical canon for Catholic and Orthodox Christians, though not for Protestants or Jews. The historical Ben-Sira lived around 180 before the Common Era. But the Alphabet of Ben-Sira that concerns us was written roughly 1,000 years later, and is not by the historical Ben-Sira at all. It is a pseudepigraphical work, meaning it is attributed to a famous figure from the past, but was actually written by someone else much later, and it is deeply strange. The text is structured as a series of stories and proverbs, each connected to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It includes crude humor, sexual content, and satirical elements that mock both Jewish and Islamic traditions. Scholars debate whether it was meant as serious theology, as satire, as entertainment, or as some combination of all three. What is certain is that it contains the first full narrative account of Lilith as Adam's first wife, the story we explored in part 2 of our journey. Here is the relevant section, adapted and translated from the original. King Nebuchadnezzar's son has fallen ill, and the king sends for Ben-Sira to heal the child. Ben-Sira writes an amulet containing the names and images of 3 angels, along with their histories and forms. When the king asks about these angels, Ben-Sira tells him their story. The story begins with God creating Adam alone. When Adam complains of loneliness, God creates Lilith from the earth, just as he had created Adam. But Adam and Lilith immediately begin to fight. When Adam tries to compel Lilith to lie beneath him during sex, she refuses, saying, "We are both equal, for we are both from the earth." When Adam tries to force her, Lilith speaks the ineffable name of God, grows wings, and flies away to the Red Sea. Adam complains to God, and God sends the three angels Sen, Sansonoi, and Semengaloth to bring Lilith back. The angels find her at the Red Sea in the midst of mighty waters, the waters in which many Egyptians would later drown during the Exodus. She refuses to return, and the angels threaten to drown her. Lilith responds by revealing that she was created only to cause sickness to infants. The angels insist they will drown her if she does not return to Adam. Lilith then proposes the covenant. She will lose 100 of her demon children every day, but she will have power over human infants. However, if she sees the names or images of the three angels on an amulet, she will have no power over that child. The angels agree and return to heaven. Lilith remains at the Red Sea, giving birth to more than 100 demon children every day to replace those who die. This is the story as presented in the Alphabet of Ben-Sira, and it is remarkably detailed for a medieval text. It answers questions that earlier sources left vague. Why did Lilith leave? Sexual equality and Adam's attempt to dominate her. Where did she go? The Red Sea specifically. Who were sent to retrieve her? 3 named angels with specific authority over her. What was her punishment? The daily death of 100 children. What power did she gain? Authority over unprotected infants. How can she be stopped? Amulets with the angels' names. The Alphabet of Ben-Sira gave the Lilith myth a narrative coherence it had previously lacked. Earlier sources mentioned Lilith briefly, treated her as one demon among many, or alluded to her role without providing details. The alphabet presented a complete story with clear characters, motivations, conflicts, and resolutions, but the text's satirical nature complicates interpretation. Was the author seriously proposing this as theological truth? Or was this a parody of creation narratives, using an outrageous story to mock excessive rabbinic interpretation and elaborate mythology building? Scholars remain divided. What is not debatable is the text's influence. Despite its questionable origins and satirical elements, the Alphabet of Ben-Sira became the primary source for Lilith's story in subsequent Jewish and Christian tradition. It was copied, translated, and referenced for centuries. It shaped how Jewish communities understood Lilith and informed the protective practices they used against her. And crucially, it provided Christian demonologists with detailed information about a powerful female demon who could be used to support particular theological and social agendas. By the High Middle Ages, roughly the 12th through 14th centuries, Europe was experiencing both intellectual flowering and intense religious anxiety. Universities were founded. Scholastic theology reached new heights of sophistication. But this same period saw increasing concern about heresy, increasing persecution of Jews, and the beginnings of what would later explode into the witch hunts of the early modern period. In this environment, Lilith's story took on new and darker meanings. She became a symbol of female disobedience, female sexuality, and female independence, all of which were viewed with deep suspicion by medieval Christian authorities. The Church was constructing an elaborate theology of gender that positioned women as naturally subordinate to men, prone to sin, and requiring male authority to remain virtuous. Eve's role in the fall, her susceptibility to the serpent's temptation, was endlessly cited as proof of female weakness and the need for male control. Lilith, in this context, was even worse than Eve. Eve, at least, had been deceived by the serpent. She had been tricked into sin. But Lilith had not been deceived. She had chosen rebellion deliberately and defiantly. She had refused to submit to Adam's authority, not out of weakness, but out of pride and self-will. She represented the ultimate example of what happened when women refused their proper subordinate role. Medieval theologians and preachers used Lilith as a cautionary tale. What happens when a woman refuses to obey her husband? She becomes a demon. What happens when a woman claims equality with men? She is expelled from paradise and condemned to eternal suffering. What happens when female sexuality is not properly controlled and channeled through marriage and reproduction? It becomes demonic, predatory, and destructive. These messages were not subtle. Sermons explicitly compared disobedient wives to Lilith, women who spoke back to their husbands, who refused sexual relations, who asserted independence in any form, were warned that they were following in Lilith's footsteps and risked similar damnation. But the most extensive use of Lilith's imagery came during the witch trials of the early modern period, roughly the 15th through 17th centuries. This was the era of the Malleus Maleficarum, the hammer of witches, a treatise on witchcraft published in 1486 that became the handbook for witch hunters across Europe. The Malleus Maleficarum, written by two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, presented witchcraft as primarily a female crime. Women, the text argued, were more susceptible to demonic influence than men because of their intellectual and moral weakness, their carnal nature, and their inherent tendency toward deceit. The text is relentlessly misogynistic, treating female sexuality and female independence as virtually synonymous with witchcraft. While the Malleus does not extensively discuss Lilith by name, her imagery pervades the text. The book describes how witches engage in sexual relations with demons, particularly with incubi, male demons who seduce women, just as succubi seduce men. It details how witches can cause miscarriages, kill infants through supernatural means, and render men impotent or sterile. All of these are Lilith's activities, her methods, her sphere of influence. The witch trials that followed the publication of the Malleus and similar texts resulted in the torture and execution of tens of thousands of people, the vast majority of them women. The accused were forced to confess to flying through the night, attending Sabbaths where they worshipped Satan, engaging in orgies with demons, and using malevolent magic to harm their neighbors. These confessions, extracted under torture, echo Lilith's mythology in disturbing ways. The image of the witch flying through the night on a broomstick, or transformed into an owl, parallels Lilith's winged flight from Eden. The sexual congress with demons mirrors Lilith's consorting with Samael and other archdemons. The attacks on infants and pregnant women directly replicate Lilith's primary form of predation. The witch trial testimonies, in effect, describe human women doing exactly what Lilith was said to do, suggesting that Lilith's story provided a template for how demonic witchcraft was understood and prosecuted. Some scholars have argued that the witch hunts represented a kind of mass cultural trauma response to various social and economic stresses of the period. The Black Death, religious warfare, economic disruption, the breakdown of traditional social structures. Women, particularly women who existed outside normative social roles, unmarried women, widows, healers, midwives, women who were too independent or too outspoken, became scapegoats, and the mythology of Lilith provided a ready-made framework for understanding these women as demonic threats. The connection to midwifery is particularly tragic. Midwives, who assisted women in childbirth, possessed knowledge of herbs and medicines, and often served as informal medical practitioners for their communities, were disproportionately accused of witchcraft. The Malleus explicitly targets midwives as particularly dangerous witches, claiming that no one harms the Catholic faith more than midwives. Why were midwives such targets? Because they presided over the liminal space of birth, the threshold between life and death that was Lilith's primary domain. Because they possessed knowledge, particularly knowledge of female bodies and reproduction, that male authorities did not have and could not fully control, because they were present when things went wrong, when babies died or mothers hemorrhaged, and their presence made them convenient scapegoats for tragedies that were actually unavoidable given medieval medical limitations. The association between midwives and Lilith worked both ways. Midwives were accused of being servants of Lilith, doing the demon's work in the mortal realm. But midwives were also among those most concerned with protecting against Lilith, creating and distributing the very amulets and charms that were supposed to ward off the demon. They occupied an impossible position, both protectors against Lilith and potential agents of her predation, depending on whether a birth went well or badly. Medieval grimoires, books of magic and demonology, feature Lilith prominently. These texts, which circulated in manuscript and later in print, claimed to provide instructions for summoning and commanding demons, including Lilith. They describe complex rituals involving circles, sigils, incantations, and offerings designed to call forth specific demons and bind them to the magician's will. Lilith appears in these grimoires as the Queen of Demons or the Queen of the Night, possessing vast knowledge and power that could be accessed by those brave or foolish enough to summon her. The rituals for calling Lilith are elaborate and dangerous, requiring precise timing, typically during the dark of the moon, specific locations, often crossroads or ruins, and extensive protective measures to prevent the summoned demon from harming the magician. What knowledge did these grimoires claim Lilith could provide? Secrets of seduction and sexual magic, methods for cursing enemies, techniques for causing sterility or inducing fertility, knowledge of herbs and poisons, prophecies about the future, and understanding of the deeper mysteries of creation and the fall. Lilith, having been present at creation, having spoken with God, having learned the ineffable name, possessed knowledge that no other demon could offer. But summoning Lilith was portrayed as extraordinarily risky. She was not a demon who served meekly once called. She was a queen, a being of tremendous will and power, who might agree to bargains, but could never be truly controlled. The grimoires warn that magicians who summon Lilith without proper preparation and protection often end up dead, driven mad, or possessed by the demon they sought to command. These grimoires reflect a fascinating tension in medieval and early modern magical thought. On one hand, they present magic as a science, a set of techniques that can be learned and applied to achieve specific results. On the other hand, they acknowledge that dealing with demons, especially powerful demons like Lilith, is fundamentally dangerous and unpredictable. The magician attempts to impose order and control through ritual, but the demons remain wild, dangerous, and ultimately beyond human mastery. In medieval Jewish communities, the fear of Lilith remained intense and practical. The Kabbalah, the tradition of Jewish mysticism that flourished in medieval Spain and later in other regions, incorporated Lilith into complex theological schemas. In Kabbalistic cosmology, Lilith is often paired with Samael as the demonic counterpart to the divine union of God and the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of the divine. This pairing gives Lilith cosmic significance beyond her role as a child-stealing demon. She becomes part of the fundamental structure of reality, representing the left side, or the side of severity, in the Kabbalistic tree of life. The Kabbalah operates on the principle that divine energy flows through 10 sephirot, 10 emanations or attributes of God, arranged in a specific pattern. The right side of this pattern represents mercy, kindness, and expansiveness. The left side represents judgment, severity, and constraint. Lilith in this system is not simply evil, but represents the necessary severity and judgment that balances divine mercy. Without the left side, the universe would collapse into undifferentiated chaos of endless forgiveness and no consequences. Lilith's role in this reading is cosmically necessary even as it is terrifying and must be resisted. The Zohar, the foundational text of Kabbalah written in 13th century Spain, contains numerous references to Lilith. It describes her as Samael's consort, as the ruler of demons, as the adversary of the Shekinah, and as a constant threat to humanity. The Zohar presents elaborate protections against Lilith, including specific prayers, divine names, and ritual actions designed to keep her influence at bay. One particularly interesting Kabbalistic text describes Lilith as having dominion over Friday night, the beginning of the Jewish Sabbath. This creates a theological problem because Sabbath is supposed to be a time of holiness, rest, and divine blessing. How can a demon have power during the most sacred time of the week? The answer, according to the Kabbalists, is that Lilith's power on Friday night is precisely why certain Sabbath rituals are necessary. The lighting of Sabbath candles, the recitation of specific prayers, the sexual union of husband and wife on Sabbath Eve, all of these serve to sanctify the time and drive out Lilith's influence. The rituals are not merely celebratory, but protective, actively combating demonic forces that threaten to corrupt even the holiest times. This understanding transforms the Jewish Sabbath from simply a day of rest into a weekly spiritual battle against Lilith and the forces of the demonic realm. The family that properly observes Sabbath is not merely being pious, but is actively defending against supernatural assault. Every ritual has defensive significance. Every prayer is a weapon. Every act of sanctification creates a barrier against the darkness. Medieval art occasionally depicts Lilith, though always in demonic rather than sympathetic forms. She appears in manuscript illuminations as a serpent woman, with the upper body of a beautiful woman and the lower body of a serpent. This imagery connects her to the serpent in the Garden of Eden, and indeed, some medieval sources explicitly identified Lilith as the serpent, or as the force controlling the serpent during Eve's temptation. This identification served multiple purposes. It made Lilith responsible not just for her own rebellion, but for humanity's fall. If Lilith was the serpent, then Eve's sin was actually Lilith's revenge. The first wife corrupting the second wife, and bringing about the expulsion from Eden that Lilith herself had already experienced. It created a direct line of female rebellion from Lilith to Eve, suggesting that disobedience and susceptibility to demonic influence were inherently female characteristics. Other artistic depictions show Lilith as a beautiful woman with wings, talons, and wild hair, often naked or provocatively dressed, emphasizing her seductive danger. These images served as warnings about the dangers of female sexuality, uncontrolled by marriage and male authority. They decorated the margins of religious texts, appeared in churches, and were used as moral instruction, showing what happened to women who refused their proper roles. The medieval period also saw the development of elaborate demonological hierarchies, attempts to categorize and rank all the demons mentioned in various texts. In these hierarchies, Lilith typically appears at or near the top of female demons, often described as a queen or princess of hell, ruling over lesser succubi and night demons. One such hierarchy describes her as one of the 4 wives or queens of Satan, alongside Nama, Agrat Bat Malet, and Ishith Zenunim. Each of these demon queens has specific times when her power is strongest, specific methods of attack, and specific vulnerabilities. Together, they represent the feminine aspect of demonic power, the dark mirror of female sanctity. These hierarchies reflect an obsessive need to catalog, categorize, and understand the demonic realm. If demons could be mapped, numbered, and ranked, then perhaps they could be better resisted and controlled. Knowledge was power, even knowledge of evil. By understanding Lilith's position in the demonic hierarchy, her methods, her weaknesses, her associations, the faithful could better protect themselves against her attacks. As the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, and eventually to the Enlightenment, belief in demons began to wane among the educated classes. The witch trials eventually ended, though not before claiming tens of thousands of victims. Scientific explanations replaced supernatural ones for phenomena like disease, infant mortality, and nocturnal emissions. The world was being disenchanted, demons and angels retreating into the realm of metaphor and symbol rather than literal reality. But Lilith did not disappear. She transformed once again, as she had transformed from Mesopotamian storm demon to first woman to medieval witch. This time, she would become something unexpected, a symbol of female liberation, a feminist icon, a representation of the unchained feminine power that refuses to submit. But that transformation required the Romantic movement, required poets and artists to reimagine her, required the 19th and 20th centuries to reclaim her from the demonological tradition and give her new meaning for a new age. The year is 1868. In London, the pre-Raphaelite painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti is working on a painting that will dramatically shift how Lilith is perceived in Western culture. The painting is titled Lady Lilith, and it depicts something that medieval Christians would have found incomprehensible: Lilith as an object of beauty rather than terror, as a figure of fascination rather than fear. In Rossetti's painting, Lilith sits before a mirror, combing her long, luxurious red hair. She is beautiful, sensual, almost languid in her self-absorption. There is nothing obviously demonic about her. No wings, no talons, no visible signs of her supernatural nature. She is simply a woman, but a woman of extraordinary beauty and self-possession. The painting includes symbolic elements, poppies suggesting sleep and dreams, white roses suggesting purity corrupted, a mirror reflecting her vanity. But the overall effect is one of attraction rather than repulsion. Rossetti wrote a sonnet to accompany the painting, describing Lilith as a witch whose enchanted hair draws men to watch the bright web she can weave, till heart and body and life are in its hold. The poem emphasizes Lilith's power to ensnare men through beauty and sexuality, but it presents this power with a kind of admiration, even celebration, rather than pure condemnation. This romantic reimagining of Lilith marked a crucial turning point. For the first time in centuries, a major European artist was presenting Lilith not as a monster, but as an aesthetic ideal, a representation of beauty, sexuality, and feminine power that could be appreciated rather than simply feared and rejected. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and 19th centuries was characterized by a fascination with the exotic, the mysterious, the dark, and the forbidden. Romantic poets and artists were drawn to figures from mythology and religion who embodied transgression, rebellion, and passion. Satan himself became a romantic hero in works like John Milton's Paradise Lost and Percy Bysshe Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, reimagined as a noble rebel against tyranny rather than simply the embodiment of evil. Lilith fit perfectly into this romantic sensibility. She was a rebel against divine authority. She chose freedom over security. She refused to submit to patriarchal power. She was associated with sexuality, with the night, with forbidden knowledge. All of these qualities made her attractive to romantic artists seeking figures who challenged conventional morality and social norms. Other 19th century artists followed Rossetti's lead. John Collier painted Lilith in 1887, showing a beautiful naked woman wrapped around by a serpent in an Edenic setting. The image is openly erotic, presenting Lilith as a figure of sexual danger, but also sexual allure. Kenyon Cox painted Lilith in 1892, depicting her as a seductive beauty standing beside the serpent, clearly implying her identity as the tempter in Eden. These artistic representations did something radical. They humanized Lilith. They made her comprehensible not as an abstract demon, but as a woman, a beautiful, powerful, defiant woman. And in doing so, they opened the possibility for reinterpreting her entire mythology. If Lilith was not purely evil, if her beauty and power could be appreciated, then perhaps her rebellion was not purely evil either. Perhaps her refusal to submit to Adam had been justified. Perhaps her claim to equality was legitimate. Perhaps the story of Lilith was not a cautionary tale about the dangers of female disobedience, but rather an inspiring story about the first woman who demanded to be treated as a person rather than a subordinate. This reinterpretation accelerated in the 20th century, particularly as feminism emerged as a social and political movement. Early feminists, seeking historical and mythological precedents for female resistance to patriarchy, discovered Lilith and recognized her as a powerful symbol. The process began slowly. In the early 20th century, mentions of Lilith in feminist contexts were tentative, acknowledging her as an interesting figure, but not yet fully embracing her. But by the mid-20th century, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, during the second wave of feminism, Lilith was being actively reclaimed and celebrated. Feminist scholars and writers pointed out that Lilith's crime was demanding equality. She had been created equal to Adam, and she refused to accept subordination. For this, she was demonized, literally transformed into a demon in the mythology. But from a feminist perspective, this demonization said more about patriarchal anxieties than it did about any actual evil in Lilith's actions. Lilith became a symbol of resistance to patriarchy, of female autonomy, of the right to refuse, of sexuality claimed and controlled by women rather than by men. She represented the woman who would rather be called a monster than accept being treated as less than human, who would endure punishment rather than submit to unjust authority. This feminist reclamation of Lilith manifested in various ways. Lilith magazines and journals were founded, publications dedicated to feminist thought and women's liberation. The most famous was Lilith magazine, a Jewish feminist publication first published in 1976 that continues to this day. The choice of name was deliberate and provocative, claiming the demonized first woman as a symbol of modern Jewish feminism. In 1997, the musician Sarah McLachlan organized the Lilith Fair, a concert tour featuring exclusively female musicians and female-led bands. The Lilith Fair was a commercial and cultural success, demonstrating that female artists could headline major concerts and festivals, challenging the male-dominated music industry. The choice of the name Lilith was significant, identifying the tour with a figure who had challenged male dominance and paid a price for it, but who had never surrendered. The Lilith Fair toured for 3 years, from 1997 to 1999, and was revived briefly in 2010. It raised millions of dollars for women's charities and provided a platform for female artists who were often marginalized in mainstream music venues. The symbolism of Lilith, the woman who refused to be subordinate, was directly relevant to the tour's mission of promoting female artists in an industry that often treated them as secondary to their male counterparts. In modern neo-paganism and goddess spirituality movements, Lilith has been embraced as a dark goddess, a representation of female power in its shadow aspects. Unlike the exclusively benevolent mother goddess figures that dominate some forms of neo-paganism, Lilith represents the goddess who destroys as well as creates, who judges as well as nurtures, who embodies female sexuality as a source of power rather than as a service to male desire or procreation. Modern pagan rituals to Lilith often emphasize self-empowerment, boundary setting, and the reclaiming of sexuality. Practitioners invoke Lilith when they need strength to resist coercion, when they are setting boundaries in relationships, when they are reclaiming their bodies and sexualities from external control. She is called upon not as a demon, but as a divine feminine force that supports female autonomy and self-determination. This modern goddess worship of Lilith would horrify medieval demonologists, but it represents a complete reimagining of her mythology. In this interpretation, Lilith's punishment was unjust. Her demonization was patriarchal propaganda, and her true nature is as a protector and empowerer of women who refuse subordination. However, this reclamation is not without controversy. Some Jewish feminists, while appreciating Lilith as a symbol of resistance, are troubled by her association with infant death and attacks on women. Can a figure who is mythologically responsible for killing babies really be reclaimed as a feminist icon? Does celebrating Lilith require ignoring or minimizing the more disturbing aspects of her mythology? Various responses to this concern have been proposed. Some argue that the violent aspects of Lilith's mythology were patriarchal additions, ways of demonizing female power and independence by associating it with the worst possible crimes. In this view, the real Lilith was simply a woman who demanded equality, and the child-killing demon aspects were later corruptions of her story, designed to make her seem monstrous. Others suggest that Lilith's violence can be understood as misdirected rage. She attacks the children of Eve because Eve accepted the subordinate position Lilith refused. Her attacks are a form of revenge against a system that replaced her with a more compliant woman. While this does not excuse the violence, it contextualizes it as a response to trauma and injustice rather than as inherent evil. Still others embrace Lilith's darkness as part of her power. The divine feminine in this interpretation is not only nurturing and life-giving, but also fierce, protective, and capable of destruction when threatened. Lilith represents the aspect of the goddess that will kill to protect autonomy, that will destroy rather than submit. This is uncomfortable for those accustomed to sanitized images of the divine feminine, but it represents a more complete and honest understanding of feminine power. In popular culture, Lilith appears frequently in television, film, video games, and literature. She is a character in the TV series Supernatural, portrayed as the first demon, mother of monsters, and a major antagonist. In Castlevania, both the video game series and the Netflix animated adaptation, Lilith is referenced as a powerful vampire or demon. In the TV series Lucifer, she is Lucifer's mother and the mother of demons. In the Borderlands video game series, a playable character is named Lilith and possesses supernatural abilities. These popular culture depictions vary widely in their faithfulness to traditional mythology. Some present Lilith as purely evil, a villain to be defeated. Others portray her with more nuance, as a complex character with understandable motivations, even when her actions are destructive. A few present her sympathetically, as a victim of injustice who became monstrous in response to trauma. What all these depictions share is an acknowledgement of Lilith's power and significance. She is never a minor character. She is always important, always dangerous, always compelling. Her presence in popular culture keeps her name and story alive for new generations who might never encounter her in religious or mythological contexts. Modern occultism and left-hand path spiritual traditions have also claimed Lilith. These traditions, which explicitly reject conventional morality and embrace transgression as a spiritual path, see Lilith as a patron and guide. She represents the left-hand path itself, the choice to leave the safety of the garden, to embrace forbidden knowledge, to claim power even at great cost. In these traditions, Lilith is not worshipped as a demon, but honored as a dark goddess, or even as a symbol of the practitioner's own will and autonomy. Rituals invoking Lilith focus on personal empowerment, on breaking free from social